So, in this part of the lecture, I'll be going to talk about consumption in historical and international context, and we will start with a brief history of rise of the consumer society. So, an important question that faces us when we think about, consumption and consumer society is, were human beings always a, part of a consumer society? And we know that the answer is not no, right? So prior to industrial revolution that happened in England in 1800s, mid 1800s, there were very few people who were really consumers, right? And except for some elite who had a lot of money, all the people were really poor and they had very few items for themselves. So consumption was never an option for human beings for a long time. But that might seem so far off, and we are born in a very different age and era where we are so immersed in consumption that we are said to be more of a consumer society. And one question that you can ask yourself is, do you agree with this characterization of our society, of being as a consumer society? And the answer depends on whether you consider yourself as consumers or not, right? And this is closely tied to the idea of consumerism, right? Consumerism is a ideology that says that one's sense of identity and meaning is defined largely through the purchases and use of consumer goods and services. And this ideology is essentially based on considering human nature, whether humans are consumerist, in a sense, or whether it is an acquired trait. It is a very important question that economists as well as other social scientists keep asking about human nature. So, in a society in which large part of people's sense of identity and meaning is achieved through the purchase and use of consumer goods and services, then we are definitely living in a society which is a consumer society. Historians have placed the birth of consumer society variously from the 16th century to mid 1900s. Although, as I said before, consumerism took root in 18th century, it took some time before it fully blossomed. At the dawn of industrialization, it was not at all clear that the workers would become consumers, right? So, early British industrialists, in fact, complained that their employees would work only until they had earned their traditional weekly income, and then they stopped until the next week. And for them, leisure was much more important than consumption or increasing their income and using that income to buy different goods and services. And remember, we are talking about people who did not have 1/10 of what we own today, right? So, and but this attitude at that time was widespread in these pre-industrial societies, and this attitude was also incompatible with mass production and mass consumption, right? So people were not consumers. They did not think themselves as, consuming more and more things. So there were no incentives for the producers to produce more things and people to consume more things. So it was a very different society in pre-industrial world, right? So let's see what happened. So something else was also going on along with the industrial revolution. That as industrial revolution began, we saw that people were not really consumers. So to increase production, you need consumers who would consume your items. So something else also happened along with the rise in consumption, and that was lowering of wages and imposing strict discipline on workers to force them to work longer hours. Early textile mill frequently, employed women, teenagers, and even children because they were easier to control and could be paid less and made to work longer hours. That also, contributed to increase in people's income and also encouraging a consumerist attitude, and we'll see how that continued over the years. But remember this, so this is a image of a factory in Britain, and if you have read Charles Dickens novels, you will know that the widespread poverty, long working hours, very low wages was one of the main characters of Industrial Revolution. And if you have not read Charles Dickens novels, I highly recommend you to read it to understand how do we transformed into a society that we live in, where we depend on production and consumption a lot to propel our economic growth as well as social and political growth. So it's a very important thing to understand where we started and how we became the society that we are, and this is one of the key elements of what was going on. So other historical developments that helped us become a consumer society was based on developing these consumerist uh, attitudes, and one of the invention was the invention of department store in mid 19th century in England. And department stores introduced this idea of shopping not only as for consumption but also as a spectacle, with entertainment, with elaborate interiors, with seasonal displays and parades and so on. So a consumerist attitude was being encouraged among people who just considered them to be workers. So, workers were also being made into consumers throughout this change in the economic system, starting with the industrial revolution and then starting with developing these ways of making people think more about consumption. And one way was, of course, the department store, and the second was what was happening in the United States in early 20th century, which was the rise of shopping malls, right? Suburbanization in the United States in the mid 20th century was supported by the construction of large shopping malls away from the city but easily accessible by automobiles, and that happened in early or mid 20th century in United States, and that is still the case if you think about it, that our shopping experience is linked to not only what we consume but also is linked to this elaborate interiors and displays and entertainment that is linked with the idea of shopping. And another important institution that was emerging and that helped in encouraging this consumerist attitude was the expanded credit card. So, creation which expanded consumer credit, particularly in early 1940s, is very important in understanding what made everyone jump on to this consumer brand wagon. And this graph kind of illustrate what happened to the rise of consumer credit and credit card debt in US. This illustrates the revolving debt in United States from 1968 to 2017, which is adjusted for inflation. And revolving debt, which consists almost entirely of credit card debt, has been increasing and increasing since 1968, and it increased by a factor of 100 from 1968 until about 2007, and where it drops, and you know why, right? Because when we had our banking system collapse, the Great Recession caused households to reduce their debts as spending declined and credit became less available. So that is the drop that you see in 2007, starting 2007 to going to 2012. Around 2012 it also started rising. So most recently credit card debt has begun to rise again, although it hasn't yet reached the peak level prior to the financial crisis. So as per the data in mid 2017, total outstanding credit card debt in the United States is about 960 billion, which is equivalent to more than 7,600 per household, right? So this revolution is also one of the important things that propelled the consumerist attitude, and propelled us becoming a consumer society.